Welcome everybody to Vernacular Verbose, proper episode 1. I'm excited today. Eugene, why am I excited? What are we doing today?
Well, because it's our first album discussion, first full album, track by track.
Yeah, today we are kickstarting our deep dive of the Tull discography, the complete 21-disc This Was to Christmas album discography. And of course, that means we're starting with 1968's This Was, the band's debut record. This is an album which, Eugene, I'd be really interested to hear your kind of first impressions, I guess, of this album when you think of this album in your mind. To me, this album is very clearly a unique sort of redheaded stepchild of the discography, right?
Yeah, kind of. I think, well, it's definitely different from a lot of other albums in the Tull discography, and it stands out for that. When I listened to it back in the day, when I first listened to it on a cassette, I didn't really think that it was that different. I just took it in stride that this was something that Tull was. Just like the other albums. And as I listened to it yesterday while preparing for the podcast, I haven't actually listened to it a lot for the last years, and I really enjoyed it. One of the things, because it hasn't been one of my favorite Tull albums for a long time. And it probably still isn't, but I was sort of surprised as I came back to it with fresh ears how solid it sounded, and how many tiny seeds of what Tull was to become were in it.
I think it's interesting you mentioned that, because I think there's definitely aspects of this album, which we'll get into because we're going to be going through this track by track and talking about everything. But there's definitely aspects within the album that I think kind of reveal where they were going in the future. Specifically things that I assume that Ian Anderson was more involved with as opposed to other members of the band, and kind of showing what his real songwriting interests were. But that being said, the reason this album is unique to me, aside from the fact that it's a blues album, which, I mean, you know, no other Jethro Tull album is, arguably. It's a pure blues album for the most part. When I think of this album, I think of if Jethro Tull never became successful, and they didn't go on to do all the things they did, have all the different prolific eras they did, what would this album's legacy be? You know, assume that like this was the only thing that this band ever made. You know, it would have totally colored our view of this band and these musicians totally differently, because it sounds very much of a different era. It sounds very much of a different style. And it came out of that London club scene where the John Evan Band, as they were known, you know, in the beginning, were coming from. And it's really interesting to hear how it's more in the mainstream of that era of British music, I think, compared to a lot of other Tull things.
Oh, absolutely, yes. I agree. It's very 60s.
Right.
And if it had been the only album they released, then they would have been one of those brilliant one-off late 60s pre-psychedelic blues bands.
Right, yeah. So one of the things that we have to mention with this album is, first, just to take us through kind of the member lineup. Of course, on this album, we had Ian Anderson on vocals and flute, as we always do. Mick Abrahams on electric guitar, which this, as I think most people know, was the only Tull album to feature Mick Abrahams and the only Tull album to not feature Martin Barre on guitar. And Mick Abrahams, I mean, is undeniably a massive part of this album and the way it sounds, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So much of what makes this album a blues album is Mick.
Yeah, I mean, I think he alone shapes so much of what this album was. It would not be at all what it was without him, for sure. And to finish off the member lineup, Glenn Cornick on bass and Clive Bunker on drums. So there was a lot of talk about how Mick Abrahams was, in a way, almost the front man of the band at this time, which is really interesting to think about.
And the producers, for some of the time, wanted him to be the front man. I think there was a time when the producers wanted Ian to step back and like play keyboards or stuff, instead of being the flute and harmonica man.
There's a lot of things written about how when the band were sort of playing back then, the band was known for Mick Abrahams, that he was the draw of the group. And a lot of the audience, when they came to watch Tull, they were coming to watch his solos and watch his playing and that kind of thing. So that's obviously very different from the Tull that it ended up becoming. So it's another example of how different that the band was at this time.
Yeah, and I think Mick was older than the band, so he would have had more recognition.
Right, yeah. Also coming from McGregor's Engine, which was the same band which Clive Bunker came out of Into Tull originally. So I think Mick was sort of already established guitarist and blues musician at that time.
Yeah.
So it's kind of funny. It took me a while before I realized the meaning behind the title. As funny as that might sound, but it wasn't until many years after I first heard this album that I saw an interview with Ian somewhere where he mentioned, the meaning behind the title was that he knew at that point, already back then, that there was no way he was going to continue playing in a band like this, that he didn't want to play blues, that he believed that was a style of music that was specifically for Black Americans to play, and that he felt like an imposter playing it. And so he deliberately decided to name the title This Was Jethro Tull, because that was a snapshot of where the band were at the time.
Do you really think that he consciously wanted for it to come across like that at the time, or was it like more of a retrospective looking back?
I think it probably was intentional, just because the title is so random otherwise. And if I remember right, on the liner notes for the vinyl, it says something like, "These are the songs Jethro Tull recorded when they were like this," or something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but...
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the things that one of the impressions that the album tried to make was with the cover art, where they posed as very old people.
Yeah, I was about to bring that up.
And to kind of add that to the idea of nostalgia, with them posing as old people and talking about things that were. Maybe that's what they wanted it to look like on the surface, with the name and the cover.
Yeah, definitely. Like, the cover art definitely links into that, for sure. I was about to ask you about that. In general, how do you feel about the cover art?
I'm not a massive fan of it, but I like it.
Mm-hmm.
It's quirky. And in the Steven Wilson reissue liner notes in the huge booklet, they talk about how they made the decision to not include the band name and the album name on the covers to make people pick up the record and turn it around. Interesting how in 1968 the same decision was employed by King Crimson, who made the cover for In the Court of the Crimson King with the schizoid man face. And with one of the things that they wanted to do was to make people take notice.
Right, yeah, it was totally a marketing gimmick.
Interesting how two bands, basically, who both played at the Marquee, had the same idea.
Right.
For very, very different kinds of music, even though they both were part of the prog rock scene, or Jethro Tull was becoming part of the prog rock scene.
And that story makes me think about the differences in how album artwork is treated today versus then. And I know this is getting off on a bit of a tangent, but today, that wouldn't even be a consideration, because all that album art is today is just a little JPEG, on your screen. But back in the day, when you were buying records, if you go to a record store today, it's the same kind of experience where you don't really know what to buy because you don't know what anything sounds like. And the only thing you have to go off is what the records look like. And so, I know we're kind of younger, I suppose, so maybe for older audiences, it's not that hard to imagine. But today, the album cover is not important anymore, arguably. But back then, it was everything. It was how you sold records.
I imagine that with vinyl coming back today, it's becoming more important again, arguably.
Yeah, I would just wonder if there's a lot of people buying vinyl records which they haven't heard already in some form.
I imagine not. I imagine there's always an opportunity for people to listen to a record at the store or check it out on Spotify before they buy it.
One last thing on the cover art I was going to mention is, so what I have written, this is verbatim from my notes I have on the album. About the cover art, I said, it's a little weird, but I guess it works. And so that's kind of how I feel about it. I think the funniest part of it, aside from the dogs, I guess, is like the very obviously fake background, which is just like a painted scrim or something.
Yeah. I also remember, I think, Ian telling a story about after issuing this album, after Tull had issued this album, people expected them to be older than they were.
Yeah.
They actually thought that was what they looked like, which is funny.
Yeah. It's definitely not what I picture when I think of what this album sounds like. I don't picture what is shown on the cover, for sure.
Absolutely, because it has a kind of a youthful energy to it.
Right. So it's an odd match, but I think it was very much designed to be that way.
Of course.
Okay, so let's dive headfirst into our track-by-track analysis of This Was.
Yeah.
So track 1, My Sunday Feeling. So this is obviously a 12-bar blues song, as a lot of songs on this album are. The thing that I like about it is that it's just weird enough and unique enough to where it's not just a boring blues song, if you know what I mean.
Oh, yes.
So specifically, there's that sort of central rhythm that the guitar and drums are playing, which I love the drum part in this song, and I think it's a really great example of Clive Bunker's playing.
Yeah, he does a really jazzy kind of idiom with all the fills and little embellishments.
Yeah.
And the groove.
I usually call him like an octopus drummer, in the sense that the way that he structures his parts is so interesting, because he's often playing all over the kit. Like, his arms are everywhere in places where you wouldn't usually expect him to play that way. And that's why this song has a really good example of that, because he's, instead of just keeping his left arm on the snare, which, I guess a typical drummer would do, he's accentuating the guitar part with both the snare and the tom. So, and that's just really interesting. It's not really how most drummers, I think, would approach a song like this.
Yeah, and I think that the groove that the guitars and the drums and the main groove that the song is structured around is so very not typical for a blues.
Mm-hmm.
It's absolutely far out, as people would undoubtedly say at the time.
Right.
Because, so you don't really notice at first that it's a 12-bar blues, because it's so defined by that kind of interplay between guitar and drums and the flute.
Right, yeah, exactly. It's like, it's based in the blues tradition, but it's just unique enough to where it doesn't feel like it.
Yeah, I love how this track starts this album. It absolutely hits like a truck. I think it's a great decision for the first track on their first album.
Yeah, definitely.
People would have been really impressed by that.
I think particularly the guitar tone on not just this song, but kind of the whole album, and especially like the more banger tracks like this song. The guitar sound is so raw, and it sounds really great, I think.
Yeah. Also, I really like the coda on this track.
Mm-hmm.
It's very reminiscent of Roland Kirk, which is something, again, on the very first track. They are cementing the things that they draw inspiration from. The blues, Kirk's playing on the flute, which Ian stated that he came up with scat singing before he heard Kirk, but it's not just that, it's the little moans and the little kind of groans and moans that he does between phrases are very Roland Kirk.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned, like, referencing their influences, because the outro of this song is actually a quote of Work song by Nat Adderley.
Uh-huh.
And I think there's a couple other instances of that on the album where they quote specific kind of, not standards, but other jazz records of the time.
Yeah, that's inevitable, and I think that that's one of the things that makes it more of a blues album.
Yeah, because like I would point to moments like the outro of this, or not the outro maybe, but the bridge sort of, where the bass goes into that kind of lounge solo.
Mm-hmm.
Those are moments that I think aren't really common on other Tull material. And it's one of those things that I think anchors this album very much to the time that it came out in. And it's very much, it comes out of that world of, jazz records and blues records, which was, unique for that band at this time.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to mention on this song, which has always been kind of weird to me, is the lyrics. Just in the sense that they're very out of character for Ian Anderson to be something that he would write about typically.
Well, a lot of the lyrics in this album aren't very typical, because this is still, I think, finding his feet.
But this one specifically, this song seems to me to be about a hangover. Maybe I'm wrong. But, Ian Anderson, for anybody who doesn't know, is famously a near teetotaler and has always refrained from drugs and that kind of thing. So I've always kind of wondered what the story was about the lyrics for this song. I actually thought it was maybe a cover for a couple years just because it sounded so unlike Ian Anderson. But my guess is that he just thought that this is what blues bands wrote songs about, and so that's sort of how it came about.
Yeah, I agree. It's kind of him assuming a character of a blues singer.
Mm-hmm.
Role-playing.
Right.
Even.
And maybe even sort of role-playing the stage persona of the crazy homeless guy in the overcoat, which he, of course, would have been known for at this time.
Sure.
Okay, next up is track 2, Someday the Sun Won't Shine for You.
In the morning, gonna get my things together, packing up and leaving this place. I don't leave your cry, there'll be a smile upon your face.
To me, in this track, it's very interesting how they decided to do the double vocals, left and right.
Yeah, that's one of the standout moments of this track, I think.
Yeah, on different editions of the album, I know the vocals can be in different channels, but generally Ian and the flute is on one side and Mick is on the other. And it's interesting how they don't try to synchronize between them. They very obviously sing the lines in a slightly different way, rhythmically and tonally. They don't try to harmonize. And this is what makes this very sparsely arranged track with just the guitar, the harmonica, and the voices, it makes it fuller, because the difference between the voices in the channels creates space, which wouldn't have been there if they had just sung it very, very similarly.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, like I said, when you first hear this song, like the very first thing that sticks out is the fact that there's two vocalists, and they're two different vocalists. So Ian and Mick together on this one, I think it's a good example of, again, like what kind of band they were back then. You know, it wasn't just Ian was the frontman. It was that you had a well-established British blues musician on there, and then Ian himself, who was still sort of finding his way in what the band would become, and of course would later kind of take it over. I have to say, for this one, this song is boring to me, to be honest. It's just too basic blues for me. To be completely honest, I've never been a huge blues fan, personally. You know, not that I hate it or anything, or I can't stand it, but there's a lot of people in the world who they're pure blues people. And, you know, Mick Abrahams is one of those people. But that has never really been me. I've never been a huge fan of blues music or a huge consumer of it. So this one is just a little bit too straight on the line for me to really be anything very interesting.
Oh, I agree on all counts, really. Because, yeah, never been a huge blues listener. And this song is very, very straightforwardly blues.
Right. Yeah, like also, probably the most straightforward blues they've ever done, recorded, probably. Yeah,
probably. And lyrically as well, the way that the song is structured and the theme of the song is structured. Begins in the morning, like so many blues songs do. And then brings up a relationship and then ends it with this kind of morale.
Right. Yeah, I actually, speaking on the lyrics, I actually kind of like the little couplet of, what is like, the sun keeps on shining, but someday it won't shine for you. That's a little poetic to me. I kind of like that one.
Yeah, kind of, yeah. Sort of, maybe a little uncharacteristically spiteful for a blues song, do you think?
Yeah.
I must correct myself when I was talking about where the voices were, where I said Ian and his flute, because that's just the image in my mind. But of course, Ian and his flute in one channel is on the next track, and this was Ian and his harmonica.
Right, yeah, there's a lot of harmonica on this song, for sure.
Yeah.
And I didn't even know about the different voices being in different channels on the re-releases, so that's pretty interesting to hear.
Yeah, I read that in the Steven Wilson booklet.
Which we should clarify, by the way, that every album that has a Steve Wilson remix is what we're listening to for this deep dive. And that's not that important early on, but it gets important later when we get into albums that had like entire new passages of music and stuff added onto it.
Yeah, we'll go back to that because there will be cases when the choice to listen to a Steven Wilson mix will be questionable.
Yeah. Next is track 3, Beggar's Farm.
Oh, you done for me, 'cause I know what you feel. When you go out, I won't ask you why, but I won't worry when I see you lying down on Beggar's.
So I'm going to go ahead and say it that this track is a standout on the album to me. To me, this one it's more interesting than most every other track on the album, and I think it's one, like we said, there were some signs of what was to come on this album, and I think this track in particular is a very good example of that. Particularly, it's very mystical sounding, is the word I would use. And I think they did a really good job of accomplishing that sound. And specifically, like, to mention specific instruments, the "You Don't Fool Me" verse, I guess that's a pre-chorus sort of. There's sort of a couple flute notes in the back of that are kind of making this really, like, swimmy, dreary type of atmosphere, which I think works really well, especially with the guitar, which is also kind of playing a similar part.
Yeah, I like this track, and I agree it kind of has that one of the sounds that they employed further on songs like Witch's Promise, maybe something with the mystical theme and mystical sound. I like the finish of this track. It kind of gets chaotic, and with the flute soloing and improvising and the guitar moving out from under the flute in different directions, kind of chromatically or stepwise, and kicking the ground from under the flute's feet, where the flute has to find the new tonal center, because that's not a diatonic harmony that the guitar is doing. It's just moving away the tonal center back and forth. It's very fun to listen to.
Yeah, it almost gets like psychedelic towards the end, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
One thing I think, though, is so the transition into the guitar solo, I think, is a little clunky on this song. I think it's kind of an example of like a poor attempt at jazz standarding, where, you know, typically you have the head, then you go into the solos, and it feels like kind of a clunky attempt at trying to do that. Although that being said, I want to mention, though, that Clive Bunker's playing on the solo is like straight jazz comping, which...
Oh, yeah.
I mean, even for Clive, I mean, he was a jazz-influenced drummer for sure, but there's very rare moments in the Tull discography where Clive gets as close to just like straight jazz drumming as he does on the solo of this song.
Yeah, maybe on some of the other tracks on this album as well, but yeah.
What also stands out to me is Glenn Cornick's bass playing on this track. I think is great. It's there's a really great quote from him in some interview where he felt that his job as a bass player was to develop interesting counter melodies to the actual melody of the song. And in some tracks he was able to do that, and in some tracks he wasn't, because he was given a riff to follow or whatever it was. But I think this is a really good example of those interesting counter melodies that he was really proficient at playing.
Yeah, I think his playing lends totally another dimension to the song.
Yeah, especially on the verses. I think the bass playing is great there.
I like the coda. It's very Roland Kirky. With the stop time, Ian just throwing out little phrases. Actually, the phrases themselves are reminiscent of Kirk tunes. From I Talk With The Spirits, from People. And the thing is, Ian does that really well. Even in my head, because this is in my music listening as a teen, I think was very much paired with Kirk's I Talk With The Spirits. Because I listened to both albums during more or less the same period. And as I re-listened to I thought, hey, isn't this a direct quote from Roland Kirk? And then I listened to I Talk With The Spirits and realized that no, this wasn't a direct quote. This was something Ian came up with himself, very much influenced by that. But in my head, that was such a Kirk phrase that if I heard it out of context, I would have thought it was Roland Kirk.
Yeah, and like without a doubt, I mean, of course we're going to get to Roland Kirk later, but without a doubt, Kirk was a huge influence on, I'm sure not just this album, but, you know, Ian Anderson as a player at the very beginning.
Yeah.
Where he was one of the only flautists, I guess I should say, you know, Ian really looked up to and was influenced by. So I think for sure his fingerprints are probably all over the album.
Must be.
Track 4, Move On Alone.
I feel so sad now that she's gone. I've been loving that woman too long. There's no place.
I must say that I really, really love this track. It's very uncharacteristic for Tull and for this album, both for the Tull discography at large and for this album in particular. And it's the first appearance of David Palmer at the time, who wrote the horns arrangement, and I absolutely love the horns arrangement. It is so characterful and so unexpected, and at the same time absolutely beautiful.
I was very curious how you were going to react to this song, so I'm really glad to hear you like it, because I'm also a big fan of this song, and I've always kind of felt like it was underrated somewhat. You know, this isn't a song that most people talk about very often. But yeah, something about the horns is great. It's kind of funny because it's such a weird little random thing. but I can't really place what it is, but just something about the way they were recorded or just how they were played or something is really awesome on this track.
Yeah, and Dee Palmer's touch on the little melodies and on their arrangement as a whole, it complements Ian's songwriting so well. I should say mixed songwriting, it's mixed song. And from the history of the recording, we know that he didn't know there were going to be horns on that. They first recorded the flute, just a monophonic single voice accompaniment.
Right.
And then Dee came in and wrote that huge Count Basie sort of horn arrangement. And I think it just works beautifully. It's a very short track for what it is.
Yeah, I think it's too short actually, maybe.
Yeah, could have been longer.
And of course the big notable thing about this song is that Mick Abraham sings it, that Ian Anderson doesn't sing anywhere in this track as far as I know.
And even doesn't really play because it's just horns. It used to be the flute on an early version, which is, it can be found on the associated recordings.
Mm-hmm.
But still, this track just has something magical about it. And of course the finish, the coda, which changes the rhythm but doesn't, because it's in 6 and it remains in 6, but the way the rhythm works is completely different. I spent some time trying to count what they were doing, and I couldn't really come to a conclusion what that is.
Yeah, that's interesting. It definitely, the drum part is more raggedy on this track than you would expect, maybe. You might expect it to be more of a straight-laced part, but he actually gets pretty wild with the snare work on some of it.
Yeah, because I think if they had recorded the horns at the beginning, then the drum part would have been influenced by that, and would have been more like maybe sort of a Salvation Army kind of sound. But since they began without the horns and the horns were added later, then it just layered up that way, where Clive first added a lot to his drum part to make the song work, and then just horns capped all that with a flourish.
Yeah, I bet if you asked Clive that, I bet he would say the same thing about this track if he remembered the session. I can kind of tell a personal anecdote on that kind of thing, where there was a couple years ago I was doing an album with a band of mine in America, and there was a song where we just had the instrumental. It was just guitar, I think, at that point, and I didn't know what kind of drum part to play, so I asked my bandmate Lewis for if he had any recommendations on what kind of part he was looking for. And he told me to, I think his quote was like, just go insane or something, just go crazy. So I played this whole 3 or 4 minute track just playing the craziest fills I could think of, just trying to go crazy. Then we did the vocals later, of course. Vocals are the last thing that we did. And, if I knew where the vocals were going to be, I would absolutely not have played what I did on that track, But that's what made the track what it is the way it was played. So I think it might be a very similar situation on this track.
Yeah, I kind of envision it happening like that. So yeah, unfortunately this track is too short to talk for it longer, because I'd love to, but it's just that's kind of all there is to it, but it's phenomenal.
Yeah, I think there's something like very wistful about it. And I think the French horns it gives it like that sort of nostalgic, like almost turn of the century type feel.
Yeah.
Like Disneyland Main Street USA or something like that kind of feel, which I'm really into that kind of thing, so I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
Track 5, Serenade to a Cuckoo.
Oh yes, I really wanted to talk about this track because obviously it's Roland Kirk's Serenade to a Cuckoo, played by Jethro Tull. And since I love Roland Kirk very much, and I started listening to Roland Kirk because of this track, at more or less the same time as I mentioned before, because my dad's friend, who was a huge jazz listener, he knew that I was listening to Jethro Tull, and he just made a copy of Roland Kirk's album on a tape and gave it to me. I think they have a very interesting approach to Kirk's material here, because when compared to Roland, to Rassan, Ian plays it the main theme, and not the improvisation part. He plays it very carefully, almost gingerly.
Yeah, for sure. I was going to mention that.
In Kirk's original, it's also not very forceful, but he's got that very odd, very hollow kind of flute tone on it. I think he wanted to make a reference to specifically to what he heard a real life Cuckoo's voice in his head. But then with the improvisation, Kirk just goes completely wild and raw, but also very clean, while Ian plays it very passionately with a lot of scat singing, with a lot of groans. But what happens there is I feel that Ian gets a little bit restricted by what the band is playing around him.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So when he's going ham with all the passion he can muster to just trying to out-Kirk, he doesn't really receive enough support from the band, particularly from the guitar.
Mm-hmm.
And with his tone, his flute tone on this album still being a budding flautist, it's not quite up to snuff. It's a little not quite sharp enough.
Yeah, I have to say I like the original Kirk version more than this, and I think for the main reason you said, that the very hollow flute sound is a huge part of how that original track was played. And I think it's not even really attempted, I think, on this cover. It's done in a more straight-laced fashion.
Yeah, because I don't think he wanted to just copy him. I don't think Ian wanted to copy Kirk a lot, and he wanted to give it another approach. But yeah, it is a jazz tune, and I feel like if I try to rank the musicians on this track from least naturally feeling playing a jazz tune, I think Clive feels the most comfortable doing jazz things, then Glenn on the bass, then Ian, and then at the end Mick, because it's kind of both the rhythm and the solo sound kind of stilted.
Yeah, I agree. I think, one of the things that separates this one from the original track is that, unless I'm mistaken, there's not a lot of guitar on the original Kirk track, if at all.
No guitar at all, no.
Right, that's right.
It's just drums, bass, and the piano.
So that's one thing that separates this one a bit, is that, Mick is trying to do, again, kind of a watery Beggar's Farm type accompaniment, a traditional jazz guitar accompaniment, which I'm sure, maybe I'm totally wrong, but I would assume that wasn't really Mick's forte. He was more of, again, a traditional blues guitarist.
Yeah, and when he attempts a jazz solo, it feels that he's not in his comfort zone. On Kirk's track, there is a fantastic piano solo. He did play with a fantastic piano player. But yeah, this one kind of, it feels that they really wanted it to work, and it was one of Ian's party pieces, and it was one of the live highlights when they talk about this.
There's an interesting...
Ian's live highlight. But on the record, there are definitely stronger songs on this album.
I think it's nice, it's not bad, for sure.
Yeah, I don't hate it.
Yeah, for sure. I don't hate it either, definitely. There's an interesting anecdote from the booklet, the Steve Wilson booklet, where Ian mentions that they played this song at Newport Jazz Festival, and Roland Kirk was actually there in the audience, but he didn't know it, and he was mortified by it.
I can imagine. But yeah, and he also mentions that Kirk was very supportive.
Yeah.
And he said nice things, which Ian didn't believe at the time, but probably he actually liked it, because just some kids playing his music.
I didn't listen to Roland Kirk that much when I first got into Tull, just because I didn't listen to jazz at all. But later on in high school, I started to get a bit more into him, and especially the Inflated Tear, I never really knew how you pronounce that. I liked that album a lot in high school, especially Fly By Night and Levliloquy. I listened to those songs a lot.
Yeah, that's a great album. It's much more saxophone heavy, I think. I Talk With the Spirits is the most flute-oriented album in Kirk's discography.
Yeah.
And Inflated Tear/Tear is the more saxophone, and all the weird saxophones that Kirk played, like the Manzello and the straight alto sax and the curved soprano sax and all that stuff.
Right. This track is definitely, just to close it out, I think this is, without a doubt, the closest that Tull have ever come to jazz, except for maybe Beret on Stand Up.
Yeah. And in the liner notes, when talking about Serenade to a Cuckoo, Ian mentions that it's kind of in the same headspace for him as Beret.
Yeah, definitely. And it's easy to see how, right? Track 6, Dharma For One. Okay, so this one's kind of funny to me. I mean, it's funny for a lot of reasons, I suppose, but this is one of the 2 showpiece tracks on the album.
Yeah.
With this one being a showpiece, of course, for Clive Bunker, as most of the song is just a big drum solo. There's kind of a lot we can say about this one, I think, because there's a lot of kind of history with this song, funnily enough. So I'll say first that even though I'm a drummer, I'm not really a fan of drum solos. I've always just found them to be kind of plodding and too much. And so to that degree, I'm already a little bit predisposed against this one. But how do you feel about it?
I like it. I have absolutely nothing against drum solos, really, because I'm one of the people who enjoys listening to a drum solo. And I think Clive pulls it off fantastically well.
Yeah, there's some great funny stories about them recording this track on the booklet, where there's a story where, so Clive did his solo in 3 takes apparently, but the first 2 takes he was playing too long.
Yeah.
And so apparently they sent Ian out with a big alarm clock, then they held it in front of Clive while he played, and they waited for it to go off so he knew when to stop playing. That's really funny.
Yeah, and they were dying with laughter as he did that.
The thing I like about this track is basically the non-drum solo parts. I think the guitar tone is awesome on this track. It's really raw and heavy, and I think it works really, really well.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the claghorn is it complements the guitar tone really well.
So you should explain the claghorn for anyone.
I should explain the claghorn, yes. I think it was, as described by Ian, a saxophone mouthpiece stuck onto an Indian bamboo flute with a plastic kind of thing taped onto the other end, a plastic bell end from a toy trumpet.
Right.
And it was just a live party thing that they did, just as a joke. But I guess it stuck with this track because it sounded ethnically enough,
right,
to kind of add that Eastern sort of feeling. And I think it was dubbed Claghorn by Jeffrey Hammond because it sounded shite.
Yeah, that's a great quote in the booklet. I love that.
Yeah.
So supposedly there's some identity confusion, I think, on the inventor of the claghorn, but some places say Ian, some places say Jeffrey. But yeah, the claghorn, I mean, I think it's on there as a joke, I think, more than anything.
Yeah.
But I mean, it does, if we can point to that as an example of, things to come with, I guess, what you would call maybe an Asian influence or something like that. But again, I think it's not really meant to be taken that seriously.
Yeah, it doesn't really sound that Asian. It's just a different timbre.
Right.
That symbolizes a different kind of sound. It doesn't take anything from the Indian musical tradition or...
Right.
It just, maybe in a way, it's sort of like the Arabic themes in the music of Western composers, where they just employed the kind of melodic minor sound, harmonic minor sound, to symbolize. And Jethro Tull don't even do that. It's just a timbre.
Yeah, I think more than anything, it was, number one, it was just a joke because they thought it was funny. And and number two, it was just one of those ways that Ian could get something more unique and interesting.
Yeah.
Beyond just like a typical blues band.
Something memorable. And it does work because it's kind of a powerful sound and it really adds to the track.
Yeah, I definitely like the timbre, like you said in the texture of it. I think it makes it something more unique than wouldn't have been there otherwise. In the solo, there's a certain sloppiness to Clive's playing, which is actually on a lot of different tracks, not just this one, just kind of as how he was as a drummer, which is kind of charming. When you listen to him play, especially in solos, that you can hear a lot of sticks clicking and hitting the rims and stuff like that, which I think is kind of cool. There's also there's a lot of
it makes it more emotional.
Yeah, definitely. And it's also just as a drummer, his kits, I don't know if this was intentional or not, but his kits were always very ragged sounding. And I think some of that were the kits he actually used. I think some of it was just the recording, especially on this because it was kind of raw and it was produced very cheaply. But that's always been to me a huge part of his playing, was that he was always a very ragged sounding drummer. And I think it worked for a lot of what early Tull was.
Yeah, maybe the drum sound is what's best associated with the cover art.
Yeah, definitely. I agree.
Kind of has that really raggedy kind of feeling.
There's a lot of weird bells and horns and stuff that come in on the drum solo, and it's really hard for me to picture sort of how that happened, but I guess he just had a collection of weird stuff on his kit he hit a couple times.
Yeah, that's what I think most. A lot of jazz drummers, I think, did that. Just to give a highlight, just squeeze a horn and give them kind of...
Yeah, but I'd really like to see what that looked like in the studio, because, when you hear this for the first time, it really comes out of nowhere. It's kind of interesting. One thing that's weird about this track is the live version was different. If you remember, the Isle of Wight DVD has probably the most up-to-date version of it, but the live version had vocals and had a couple of, I think, completely different musical parts, which is interesting.
Yeah, I think they released the version with the vocals on Living in the Past.
Oh, I didn't even know that. Okay. Well, that shows what kind of Tull fan I am.
Well, Living in the Past is a weird collection, so...
Yeah, I need to listen to that, because I think I like the live version more, aside from, like, the extended solo thing.
Come on, the extended solo is great. Yeah. Okay, to me, compared with the previous track, to Serenade to a Cuckoo, it's arguably, I think Dharma For One is more jazzy in spirit than Serenade to a Cuckoo, because just everyone feels more in their element, and everyone plows forward in a very uninhibited kind of way.
Yeah.
And even though you can't really say it's a jazz track, because it's just a couple of riffs, no one really improvises in any sort of jazz manner, but some of the feeling, some of the spirit of this track is a little bit more jazzy to me.
Yeah, it definitely feels like raw creation to me.
Mm-hmm.
And even at the end, like, it almost gets kind of like Hendrixy at the end, which is interesting.
Yeah, kind of.
Okay, track 7, It's Breaking Me Up.
Alright, this one, I don't really have a lot to say about this in my notes as I listened to the album yesterday. The first thing I wrote was that it's almost Zeppelin-y in the inflection, in the approach to the blues idiom. And then I brought up the notes from the Steven Wilson booklet written by Ian Anderson. And the first thing that Ian writes about it, it's very much your white man's blues. So I guess I was right when I thought about Zeppelin, because it's sort of the way British people wrote blues music at the time.
Yeah, that's interesting that you bring up Led Zeppelin. I've never thought about that with this track before, but I think you're right in terms of like the vocal delivery and that kind of thing.
Yeah, obviously not musically, but sort of some of the Yeah Baby.
Right.
In that is kind of Zeppelin-y.
Yeah, and this is, I think most people would point to this track as maybe being like a filler track or something like that. Mm-hmm. And certainly in terms of it, it's one of those tracks that's very steeply based in the blues tradition and the blues standard world. I actually kind of like it though, and I'm not really sure why, but this has always been what I felt was a little underrated. I've always kind of liked this one.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm probably not very much in love with it.
I think the drum part's interesting. It's I don't really know how to explain it in words, but it's focusing very much on like a big hi-hat explosion every couple beats, which I think is cool.
Yeah, I can hear that.
But yeah, the lyrics are definitely generic. It's just one of the most generic blues lyrics that probably Ian's ever written. I don't think this is a standard. I think it's original, so.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, something about this one has always drawn me to it a little bit, and I always put this one on, and I don't skip it when I listen to the album, I'll say that. I
don't really skip songs when I listen to albums. One of those people, so a song has to be really, really overplayed, or I have to hate it very, very much to skip one.
Yeah. Whenever I listen to music, I used to always listen front to back, but I think my attention span's getting too chipped away now.
Yeah, I don't really have a lot to say about this one. It's kind of long for what it is.
It's just a nice little traditional blues thing to me, but it's one that I don't mind much.
Yeah, it doesn't really break the flow of the album for me, so because we've just had two arguably jazz numbers with Cuckoo and Dharma For One, and to kind of root back the listener into a more simple blues song within the flow of the album, I think it works very well.
Right.
That's what I can say.
Track 8, Cat Squirrel. So this is, I mentioned there were 2 showpiece tracks in this album. This is the second of those 2, where, this is very much a Mick Abraham's guitar showpiece track. And I believe, so this is a standard, or a standard cover, however you want to say that. This was originally by Dr. Ross, who was an African-American blues progenitor from the southern U.S., and this song was later on popularized by Cream and Eric Johnson.
Interesting, because on the liner notes it says it's traditional. Is it one of those, in quotes, quote-unquote traditional tracks which actually had an author, a black American author, but which were dubbed traditional because it wasn't deemed important?
I guess because it came out of the South in that era, it would be called traditional, I guess, because it was part of the standard canon.
Yeah, that's a shame.
So this, from what I understand, Ian didn't really like this song being on the album. It was just one of those things that he just kind of allowed happen, but he didn't really think it was a good idea.
I kind of agree with him, to be honest. Because it's nice, but to me it definitely overstays its welcome.
Yeah, I agree, for sure.
So it could have been cut in half easily.
I have written in my notes too long. So I definitely agree. One thing that's cool about it, I think, or at least notable, is the guitar tone is very searing. And I mean, of course, that was intentional, but for a guitar song, that's of course fitting. But it's kind of an interesting textural point on the album, how it's like burning hot that guitar tone gets on this song.
Yeah, because I think one of the things that Ian didn't want to do on the album was to have these sort of searing, overdriven tones. That was his choice on Someday the Sun Won't Shine For You, not to have the harmonica like overdriven through an amp, but to have it very transparent and acoustic sounding. And maybe this is one of the reasons that he didn't really like this track, because this wasn't the sound he was going for.
Right, yeah. And I think, it might be fair to say that in itself, the fact that they disagreed about putting this on the album is just, one example of the disagreements that Ian and Mick had musically, which of course would come to a bigger head months after this album was released.
Yeah, I imagine it was one of the things. If they added a few different sections into this track with the flute, but maybe medleyed it into a different song, but it could have made a different impression on me.
Yeah. And you can tell very easily that of all the tracks on this album, this is a live song, which they then took into the studio, that it was like a live standard for them. So I think it's really clear, you can tell that.
I think it would have worked great in a live situation, I imagine. I don't think I would have minded it, listening to it for that long or even longer, during a live Tull concert in 1968.
Yeah, I'm sure it was awesome back then, probably. Particularly, Clive Bunker is rocking on this song, which I think he needs to be for a song like this. But
yeah, of course.
Track 9, A Song for Jeffrey.
I think that if this song were recorded a little differently, not even played, but just produced, maybe played a little differently, it could have been on Benefit. It sounds very much already like an older Tull track.
Yeah, I've never thought of that before.
Yeah, it's the first of the 3 Jeffrey songs on the first 3 albums. Each of the first 3 albums has a Jeffrey song, and I kind of thought that they would have kept writing songs for Jeffrey if he hadn't joined them.
Yeah, that could be
after
every
these
album
3 albums.
Jeffrey.
Yeah, we would have Cross-Eyed Jeffrey, and Thickest Jeffrey, and Black Satin Jeffrey, and Bad-Eyed and Loveless Jeffrey.
Yeah, that would have been awesome.
I think the vocal effects choice on this song is kind of interesting. The vocals are subdued and very difficult to discern.
Yeah, there's a lot of production choices on this song specifically which feel, different from the rest of the album, which must have been intentional. It's really kind of interesting.
But I must say I love this one. It's very much a standout on the album for me.
Yeah, this is for sure a standout, I'd say. And, when it comes to this album in retrospective, I think if this album had a hit, and I don't know if it did, but if it did, it was definitely this song, right?
Yeah, it's very much, to me, this one is very much one of the songs about what Tull would become.
I think especially on this track, the mix of slide guitar and harmonica sounds so great, and it's part of what makes the track so good. I think in general this track it's really energetic, and it's very like forward looking and more than most other things on the album, and I think that's what kind of makes it like the standout that it is.
Yeah.
The vocals, like you mentioned, they're really weird, obviously. I mean, they sound really unlike any other Ian Anderson vocal take. He mentions in the booklet how it was inspired specifically by Captain Beefheart imitating Howlin' Wolf, which is kind of an interesting inspiration to begin with.
That's wonderful.
But when I was a kid, first listening to this song, I didn't like the vocals that much. I thought it was too weird, but as I've kind of grown up, I appreciate them a bit more, and I think it makes them sound like a different band, you know? I mean, it makes them sound like there was a band from the US, I think, around this time called Pearls Before Swine. I don't know if you know them, but yeah, the vocalist of that band, it sounds like Ian's trying to imitate him. I don't know if he knew about him, but
yeah, that's a very interesting vocal choice. I wonder why they felt it was necessary, because otherwise this song is very much a Jethro Tull kind of typical sound, which would have had Ian's vocals on it. And kind of to move away from Ian's own voice was an interesting choice.
And I think it's another example of, like, this is what he thought blues music should sound like at the time. And so that's sort of what he was trying to go for with that vocal line, probably.
Probably, yes, too.
I think the lyrics on this track are fantastic. I think this song, to me, it's all about freedom. You know, it's being who you want to be. It's living the life the way that you think is best for yourself. And I think I don't want to get too cheesy with it, but I think the lyrics are almost kind of empowering in that sense, that it really kind of brings that message home.
I agree. I think this one is one of the lyrical standouts on the album.
Yeah, particularly on an album where a lot of it was very generic blues lyrics.
Yeah, I think this one and Beggar's Farm.
Yeah, I would agree with Beggar's Farm too, with lyrics. But this is definitely a banger, like definite standout early Tull track.
Absolutely.
All right, track 10, Round. So,
yeah.
There's not a lot we can say about this one.
Exactly, but I know it's one of it's not a fan favorite.
Sure.
But I really, really enjoy this track as the end of the album, because it caps it off really well. It's a snippet with no beginning or end. It's one of the things I imagined as I listened to it yesterday. It could have been cool if it were a little bit shorter and it looped indefinitely, like you have a log groove at the end of a record, but a log groove is typically a few seconds. But if it had been an indefinite loop of 10 seconds or 20 seconds, it could have been really cool, because it kind of
been awesome.
Has that atmosphere of a band in an empty bar just playing something.
Yeah, definitely. Like you said, I can't hate on this song because, I mean, it accomplishes what it's meant to do. You know, it's not supposed to be much.
Yeah, and it is as long as it has to be.
Right. And it's interesting to me how, so this track, the idea came from Terry Ellis, who, for anyone who's not familiar, was the manager of Tull for most of their heyday and was actually credited as, I think, producer on this album, or maybe co-producer with Jethro Tull. And they felt like they didn't have enough material for the album, and so Terry suggested playing just a little thing like this to end it. And it ended up becoming a round, which is where the title came from. A musical round being a piece where different instruments play the same melody but starting at different times, which is what this is. But in my notes I have, it's charming enough. I think it accomplishes what it meant to do, but it's not meant to be much.
Yeah, it absolutely is, and does.
I guess it's worth mentioning that there's piano on this track, which I think is a first. I think it's played by Ian. I could be wrong, but the last thing I'll say on Round is I really like the very end with the flute like talking. I think that's kind of cute during the fade out.
Yeah.
But that's the album. So tracks 1 through 10. So Eugene, I'm going to ask you, if you had to name your top 3 tracks from this what would they be?
Well, my top 3 tracks. Okay. I think one of these is going to be surprising to you from what we've discussed, and 2 will probably not. So my top 3 tracks in order of appearance on the album are Move On Alone, Dharma For One, and The Song for Jeffrey. I think probably Beggar's Farm coming in close fourth.
Okay, we're close. I'll tell you that. Do you want to expand on your 3 at all?
Well, we've talked already about these tracks a lot. Move On Alone, I love the horns, I love the atmosphere in this track, I love how D. Palmer added to the sound of the track. Dharma For One, I love the energy on that. I love that it's kind of raw and uninhibited, and slap bang in the middle of the album, everyone just goes ham. Song for Jeffrey, really, for me, like the most Jethro Tull out of the Tull songs on this one.
Top 3 for me, I really have a top 2, and then I have a third one with like a question mark. But so Song for Jeffrey for sure, Beggar's Farm for sure. I think those are, to me, those are the 2 that stand out head and shoulders above the rest. And then for my third, I had Move On Alone, maybe. If I had to pick a third, it would be Move On Alone. But for a lot of the reasons you said, I think Song for Jeffrey and Beggar's Farm, just from a songwriting perspective, are just on another level to the rest of the album. And Move On Alone, just, something about it is just so charming for whatever reason that it makes me want to put it up there.
Yeah, so we're pretty close, and I did realize you wouldn't have Dharma For One in your top tracks, but I do.
So if I was to ask you your bottom 3, your 3 least favorite.
I think Someday the Sun Won't Shine For You, It's Breaking Me Up, and Cat Squirrel. Because Someday the Sun and It's Breaking Me Up are just, to me, too generically blues. And Cat Squirrel, I don't know, to me, it is just not fun enough and too long for what it is.
So we're close again. So I have Someday the Sun Won't Shine For You and Cat Squirrel, both for the reasons you mentioned. I don't really feel comfortable picking a third one. There's not a third one that stands out to me as like a least favorite. I feel like I can't pick Round because you can't hate on that for what it is.
Yeah.
But if I had to pick a third, I would actually say Dharma For One. Just because with the solo, it just gets a bit too boring for me, although I do like the non-solo parts of it. But if I had to pick a third, I'd say that.
Interesting. Yeah. So yeah, we do have one we vehemently disagree on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to kind of conclude, when we look at this album like in context of Tull history and Tull discography, so for me, I guess on a personal level as well, this isn't an album that I go to very often. I mean, it's, again, like I said, it's like the redheaded stepchild of the Tull discography in a lot of ways. To me, it feels very much like a standalone album. In a lot of ways, it feels like a different band. So I'll always wonder about, what would this album's legacy have been if Tull had just called it quits or if they never made it big or anything. What are your personal, overall concluding thoughts on the album?
Well, pretty much the same as yours, I would say, because it was a direction that they didn't follow up on.
Right.
It was Mick Abraham's time with the band that came to the result that it came to. It was the blues band that never became. I wonder, one of the things you said, if they called it quits, one of the stories that the booklet mentions was that Robert Plant sang with the band while at one point while Ian was sitting in the audience, and one of the producers wanted sort of to force Robert as the new vocalist for the band. And I wonder if it had happened like that back then, if Plant would have turned Clive and Mick and Glenn into the new Led Zeppelin.
Yeah, that would have been crazy.
Or if it wouldn't have had the success that Led Zeppelin would have had.
Yeah, Zeppelin and Tull actually, they cross each other a lot in a lot of ways.
Surprisingly, yeah. They toured together. I think Jimmy Page egged Martin on as Martin was recording the solo on Aqualung.
Yep. Barry Barlow was almost chosen to replace John Bonham, but they decided to split up instead.
Was he?
Yeah. He was on the short list or something as a replacement when he died. So if you were to, I don't know if I want to use the word rank necessarily, but if you were to, compare this to the rest of the Tull discography, where would you sort of place this in relation to the rest of it?
Well, probably not among my best favorite albums, and not among my second favorite albums. Maybe sort of third tier, probably. But it isn't a bad album. I thoroughly enjoyed listening to it yesterday. I can't hate it. Very much of a different era, and like you said, it's a different band.
Yeah, for me, if I'm imagining a tier list of the Tull discography. For me, it's in like the mid to lower mid tier. There's nothing about it that I hate necessarily, but it's not something that I go back to that often. And again, when I do go to it, it's usually specifically because I want to hear something unique about the first Tull album. That being said, there's a lot of fans sort of write about categorizing the discography into eras and things like that. And even though this is like a standalone project, to me, for whatever reason, I've always identified the first 3 albums, This Was, Stand Up, and Benefit, as like, to me, that's early Tull. And, others might disagree, but when I think of early Tull, I think of the trio of the first 3 albums.
Interesting. I probably don't, because to me, these 3 albums are all really different, but we'll come to that.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense
episodes.
to say that too, for sure. Like, 'cause This Was is totally different from the 2 albums after it, but for whatever reason, I've always compartmentalized it that way in my head. Thank you, everybody, for listening to our deep dive of This Was. I hope you enjoyed going back to the very first Jethro Tull album, Jethro Tull as they were with us, and going through track by track. Let us know, whatever platform you're listening on, what are your top 3 tracks for this album? What are your bottom 3 tracks? What were we right on? What were we wrong on? Be nice, though, with what we were wrong on. If you ever want to contact us, feel free to email us at vernacularverbose@gmail.com. Feel free to let us know anything you think, and please look forward to Stand Up, the next episode. That's going to be a fun one.
Oh, yeah.
Thank everybody for listening, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.